Welcome back to Talking True Cases. I'm Mark Williams-Thomas. Before I welcome today's guest, Neil Wood, who spent years infiltrating as an undercover police officer, major crime gangs, I want to cover two cases. This case is a crime that's haunted one family and dominated the media for 15 years. A world's nightmare, and that is for the McCanns. At the Ocean Club, a holiday resort in Praia de Luz in Portugal, an area and a place that I have visited multiple times. In fact, it's a crime scene that I've visited more than any other crime scene of any other case that I've worked on. And that is apartment 5A and the surrounding area. The 3rd of May, 2007. And in apartment 5A is where on that night, Madeleine McCann was put to bed in the same room as her brother and sister. Whilst Gerry and Kate, mum and dad, went to the tapas bar and had dinner with a group of friends. Between them, they'd arranged a babysitting service, checking on each other's children. About 9:05, Gerry left to do the first check on the children. They'd agreed amongst themselves that they at different times would go and check on the children. He went into the apartment and checked on Madeleine. Madeleine, he says, was there. But the position of the bedroom door had slightly changed. This was his account. Now he leaves that and he goes back to the group where they were having dinner in the tapas bar. 5 minutes later, a friend, Jane Tanner, went to check on her children. She later told the Portuguese police that she saw a man carrying a child on the street outside, and that was the first sighting of an individual as a possible suspect. We can see there the image that she came up with that was drawn by a police artist. 15 minutes later, another friend checks on the McCann children, but did not go into the apartment. Then, around half an hour later, Kate leaves the group at the tapas bar and goes to check on Madeleine. She goes into the apartment, into the bedroom, and when she walks into the bedroom, she says that she saw the front window of that bedroom open and Madeleine had gone. She then, in a panic, runs back to the tapas bar, and at that point, she raises the alarm. The then resort become involved. They contact the police, and the police arrive. Speculation then mounts as to what could have happened to Madeleine. I was in the resort 72 hours after her disappearance. It was now attracting worldwide media attention. Everybody was covering it. And we started to see that there was certain information being fed into the Portuguese media. And in fact, the investigation had turned. It had turned towards Gerry and Kate. And what followed was a Portuguese police detective, Amoral, following a line of inquiry that Gerry and Kate, he believed, were involved in the disappearance of Madeleine. Now, Gerry and Kate have always denied this and said very clearly that Amoral has never produced any evidence to support his opinion. And later, Amoral was removed from the police investigation team into Madeleine McCann's disappearance. I've asked Mr. Amoral a number of times for an interview for him to explain to me what evidence he has to make the allegations that he has made. Then, in 2020, there was a major development when the German prosecutors announced that they had a prime suspect in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, and they came out very confidently and said that they believe Christian B is responsible for the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. He went out into the world's media, giving the identity of 2 phones that he said were being used by Christian B, and significantly, on the night of her disappearance, placed him outside the apartment in Praia de Luz where Madeleine was taken. In 2022, I undertook an investigation for Paramount and Channel 5, and my investigation showed that Christian B had an alibi, and furthermore, that the police were not actually able to place him in Praia de Luz on the day Madeleine disappeared, nor were they able to say that he was using the phone on the number that they'd circulated. My conclusion is based on considerable evidence. I've seen and spoken to Christian B, or communicated with Christian B through his lawyer. And yes, Christian B is a convicted child sex offender who groomed children, but he is not a child abductor, in my opinion. And therefore, whoever did abduct and murder Madeleine because it's now confident the police have recorded it as a murder means that that individual is still at large. And why am I talking about this case now? Well, the 3rd of May is 15 years anniversary, and to date, and still, we have no idea what happened and where Madeleine McCann is. Let me move on to the next story. And this is a story that I'm covering because it's received considerable media attention recently. ITV have done a program about it, and there has been a lot of interest. So, July 2010, in the quiet Northumbria town of Rothbury, it was rocked by the manhunt to find the killer, Raoul Moat. Moat had been out for prison for only 2 days when he embarked on a shooting spree. Whilst in prison, he was visited by his ex-girlfriend Stobbart, who claimed that she was having an affair with a police officer. Now, that was simply said to keep him at bay, to try and stop him from continuing to harass and be interested in her. Unfortunately, it served the other way. It only served to anger Moat more, and as a result of that, his hate for police just grew. Just after 1 a.m. on July the 1st, armed with a sawn-off shotgun, Moat arrived at the house where Stobbart was staying with her new partner, Chris Brown. He lay in wait, and at 2:40, when Brown left the house to confront Moat, knowing that he was outside, Moat shot Brown at close range. He then fired through the window, hitting Stobbart in the arm and stomach, and she underwent life-saving surgery. Later the same day, after calling police to warn what he was about to do, Moat shot PC David Rathband as he sat in his police vehicle on a roundabout. PC Rathband had previously confiscated a van belonging to Moat. The injury left him permanently blind. Tragically, PC Rathband took his own life in February 2012. He'd struggled to adjust to life following his horrific injuries caused by Raoul Moat. Moat, after having caused those injuries, then called the police again, this time to confess what he had done to PC Rathband. He then said that he was going to go on the run, and that as a result of that, the police tried to convince him to give himself up, but he wasn't having any of it. Moat then sent a 49-page letter to the police declaring war on them, saying that they'd taken his children away and his freedom and his girlfriend. He wrote, "The public need not fear, but the police should. I won't stop till I'm dead." And I remember that occasion very, very well. The fear that was amongst everybody, particularly police officers who were out there, knowing that an individual was determined to try and take more lives, not of the public, but of the very people who served the public, the police officers, the very people who were trying to keep them safe from him. A manhunt began. Helicopters, dogs, a Royal Air Force aircraft was even involved. 160 armed officers from around the UK joined that search. Incredibly, police officers from around all the police force firearms teams collected and moved towards Northumbria. It was the biggest mutual aid in terms of firearms officers that this country has ever seen. On July the 9th, police had Moat surrounded on the banks of the River Coquette. He was pointing a sawn-off shotgun at his neck. Then the events took a strange, bizarre turn. And in fact, many of you will have listened or watched the events unfolding on television when the former England footballer Paul Gascoigne turned up drunk and high on drugs. He arrived in his dressing gown carrying a chicken, a loaf of tiger bread, 4 cans of lager, and a fishing rod. If it wasn't so serious, it would be very funny. He was turned away by the police. The standoff continued, and then around 1:10 on the morning of July the 10th, a single shot was heard. Moat was rushed to hospital, but pronounced dead on arrival. He had shot himself. Police had fired 2 taser guns at Moat in an attempt to prevent his own suicide. His death was later officially ruled by a jury as suicide. In 2011, Moat's friend, Karl Ness, and another friend, Qhuram Awan, were convicted for aiding his crimes. Ness received 3 life sentences. He'd been with Moat on the night of Brown's murder and his attack on Stobbart, and he was told he would face a minimum of 40 years in prison. And Awan, at least 20 years. He had driven Moat around whilst he hunted for a police officer to kill. That is when he injured PC Rathband. So let's move on to today's podcast. Well, I'm really pleased to be joined by Neil Woods, who is a former UK police officer and undercover drugs operative. He's now an active member of an international drug policy reform movement. He worked undercover between 1993 and 2007, befriending gangs and gaining the trust of some of the most violent and unpredictable criminals in Britain. It is still one of those very interesting areas. We talk about the police and we talk about the police roles all the time. And in fact, you only need to turn the television on, and many channels are dominated by blue, coverage of crime, coverage of police forces. But there's still one area that I think probably still remains pretty quiet in terms of secretive, and that is the area of undercover police officers. I can tell you from my policing background is that policing undercover has changed unrecognizably, phenomenally, from the period of time when it was first brought into concept into where it is now. And of course, we have had a number of high profile cases which have brought the light on undercover policing, sometimes in a very detrimental way. But let's be very clear. These people who take this on, they take this on as part of their role, but they take it on with the greater risks that I believe it probably holds than the day-to-day police officer that goes out on the streets. And of course, it is unpredictable. You put on a uniform and you are at risk, but you take on the role of an undercover police officer, and very often you're on your own. Let's hear from Neil, and let's see how the impact they had, not just on his life, but on where he is now. So, Neil, thank you for joining us. It's brilliant to have you on board. That small summary I've given, obviously, is a snapshot of what you've done. I'd just like to kind of go right back to the very beginning. What made you want to become an undercover officer?
Well, it was by accident, really. Because I hadn't given it much consideration at all. At that point, I wasn't very good at being a uniform cop, really. I was one of those people who struggled. You'll remember those probationers who you think, are they going to make it? Are they going to make it to the end of the 2 years? That was me. But I managed to scrape through, got through to 4 years, and then I got an attachment with the drug squad. And I was one of a few people who got an attachment. The reason for that was it was 1993. And there was a moral panic going on, the biggest moral panic that we ever had. And that was about crack cocaine, because tabloid newspapers had been talking about, crack cocaine was coming, and they've been talking about how much it was destroying communities in America for a long time before we actually had any. So at the point that we suddenly had crack cocaine on the streets, suddenly it created a classic feedback loop between the public opinion and politics, and it influenced political decision making. And so the Home Office instructed all of the chief constables to concentrate on drug offences more than any other crime, with a particular emphasis on heroin and crack cocaine. And so in Derbyshire, where I was, the response to that was to try and share the expertise of the drug squad and get young cops like me an attachment. But while I was there, one of them said, "Do you fancy having a go at buying some crack cocaine?" Which was not a question I was expecting, really.
Yeah.
But I did, and they set up a very basic operation, really. A quick ops point. They gave me a £20 note and pointed me in the direction of this particular door to go and knock on. So, it was a ludicrous sort of half-planned cold call, really, and it was so ludicrous because I hadn't had any training. I hadn't even had much time to think about it. So I knocked on this door, and this huge guy opened the door, and he says, "Who are you? You're not a student, are you?" I hate students. And I thought, actually, I don't know who I am. I've no idea. I hadn't really thought about that. So I thought, that'll do. He says, "Yeah, I'm a student. Yeah, I'm a student." And he says, "Are you stupid? I've just told you I hate students." But he laughed. He found it funny. A bit of banter, and he sold me my little £20 stone of crack cocaine. So I went back to the drug squad and holding it out in my hand and said, "I've got it." And that defined the next 14 years of my life. Well, I suppose all of the rest of my life, really. It's brought me on a convoluted journey to be speaking to you here today.
And let me just take you back to the kind of, so you joined the drug squad, and obviously you're a police officer, been a police officer for 4 years. But what's your experience of drugs at this stage? I know when I joined the police force, drugs were kind of, I never got exposed to drugs at school. I kind of really didn't understand, have much knowledge of it at all. It's very different to the youth of today. What was your knowledge of it?
I was reasonably knowledgeable about it because I'm a geek with many things, including cultural aspects of society. So I've read quite a lot. Like many of my peers, I used cannabis a few times when I was 15 and 16. That was quite normal then. But yeah, I mean, I had more than average knowledge for a cop, right. I think.
So you go back and they basically say, brilliant, great, well done. And then how does it pan out after that? What's your next kind of like involvement? And did you kind of feel quite positive about that? Or did you think, do you know what, actually, I was a bit in the dark there, but actually, I've sailed by the seat of my pants and it worked? Or did that kind of give you the buzz?
I hadn't quite got the buzz by that stage. That came quite quickly. But from that point, I was really just swept along by events because they saw sudden huge advantage at this. This was literally the answer to their own pressures, really, to catch more people. And there was a lot of pressure. There's a lot of money invested into it. All of the overtime and all of the money went into the drug squad, not anywhere else. So it suddenly went from a few days operation to a few weeks, and then in no time at all, I was doing no less than 6 months at a time in a city area. And of course, it very quickly, because the first time was really easy. The guy said to me, "You take care now, don't get yourself arrested," which was very pleasant and civilized. But of course, it developed very quickly because he went to prison. And now I'm not suggesting that undercover policing hadn't happened. Undercover policing had been happening for a long time, but this was in the UK a new type of undercover policing. Because traditional, what we now refer to as level 1 undercover policing, the traditional undercover policing is generally via an introduction from an informant. It's usually almost always pitched at a high level, not the ground, not the lower level. But this level 2, as it became known eventually, type was entirely new in the UK. So it was rapidly developing. And of course,
what was done to look after you? I mean, what was the potential of walking down the street and someone saying there's a great shot of you there, and you certainly fitted the bill. And long hair at that stage?
No, I grew that.
Tied up.
I grew that. I had my top knot and my rave type haircuts. No, I grew that. So that would be probably 2 years after I started doing it.
But when, so you kind of get into this role, and what's your, do you worry that somebody might spot you, or do you worry that somebody might call you out?
Well, I just got wrapped up in developing it because I was suddenly, where I've never really been hugely excited by the job because it was always so difficult. Suddenly I was hugely excited by the fact that I was developing and rapidly developing expertise and adapting to the problems that were before me. And that was exciting, and I was starting to enjoy the intellectual exercise of lying, and managing or manipulating the people around me. And it was dawning on me that I had some talent for it. And also I knew how to develop that. So it was an exciting time. And I was starting to enjoy the danger of it, even times when I was physically in danger. But in terms of what there was to protect me, there was nothing really, because I was always very resistant to having any backup nearby, because I can account for my own behavior and my own actions, but to have to think or second guess somebody else's, that's what would make me nervous. So, it was better to be left completely alone. But I'll probably come to it later on, but that even though I was enjoying it and those adrenaline rushes, I didn't realize that it was actually causing me some mental harm, which would turn up many years later.
Let's pick that up in a bit. Let's stay on the journey. So you've now started to do this. You do a small buy at a door, which is the kind of like the test purchase, but then it develops from there, and you start becoming much more embedded into kind of like quite dangerous, risky situations.
Yeah, I mean, it just kept developing and developing because, it's my presence in that marketplace, really, and the presence of people like me, which meant that the marketplace became rapidly more dangerous. And so, being interrogated and threats of violence just became the regular thing, really.
How did you deal with that? So when someone's threatening you, I mean, do you give me some sense of how vulnerable you were feeling?
Well, I'll give you one example. I remember for an operation in Nottinghamshire, there was lots of pressure because I think it was 2003. So there was lots of gun violence going on because there's a gangster, Colin Gunn, was at war with everybody else. So there was lots of violence going on at the time. His team, the Bestwood cartel, was literally at war with everybody, and there were daily shootings going on. Now, I didn't get anywhere near his gang, but there was pressure on me to find intelligence about what was going on. But the closest I got was an introduction to one of his lieutenants. And when I met the guy, he turned up in a car, and he had his 12-year-old son sat next to him in this car. And it was a bizarre situation because his 12-year-old son was wearing exactly the same two-piece tracksuit, exactly the same gold chain around his neck, the same shaved head and the same trainers. He was like he turned his son into a mini me, and he was bringing him along, obviously, to teach him the business, I think. But anyway, he interrogated me, the father did, with a knife pressed into my groin.
Yeah.
And it felt like about 15 minutes, maybe a bit less. And that's really unsettling. It's really difficult to stay focused. And the classic interrogation was rephrasing questions and trying to catch you out. Trying to catch you out on a change of what you were saying or claiming. But by that point, I was quite well referenced into that community, and I knew lots of people I could say knew me. So it wasn't too difficult. But it is, you still have the heart pounding and the fear. And the intelligence about this guy was that he was over fond of his knife, that he liked to cut people.
Right.
To the point that Colin Gunn had apparently taken him into a field, stripped him naked, and put a shotgun in his mouth to warn him not to be so haphazard with his knife. And this had happened just before this. So it was really, really intense moment. Anyway, after the uncomfortable conversation, and he removed his blade, he sold to me, and so I was into that. I was into him then. I was gathering evidence against him. But I mean, you asked how I dealt with it. Well, I mean, I discovered that I had an advantage that some people have in adrenaline situations, in that whenever I was in a situation where I felt in that level of fear, and you get the adrenaline jolt, the effect that I had was that I had the feeling that I had all the time in the world to think it through.
Right.
That time actually slowed down, and that I had this sort of, I had the fear and I had the heart pounding, but I also had this feeling that it's fine because I've got all the time in the world to think this through. And it's obviously that's just an effect of the thought speeding up from the adrenaline, but it just made it feel like it was slowing down. So I think that was probably an advantage I had.
And is that something that you were aware you had? I mean, that's quite I've heard that often, from people who obviously are quite high pressure situations, particularly running operations and things, is that, sometimes the more pressure, the calmer they are.
Yeah, it felt like I just, that you'd had a sudden burst of super thinking. Yeah, and I discovered this a few years before. I think only 1997 was the first time I thought I was going to die, when someone answered the door to me with a samurai sword and put that to my throat. Goodness. And yeah, it's terrifying, but I never doubted I could think my way through it. I suppose there's a slight cockiness to it. And in fact, the first time, the guy with the samurai sword, I came away from that with my heroin in my hand, walked a few meters, and another guy had stuck a knife towards my stomach and tried to rob me for the heroin I'd just bought. So talking about being out of the frying pan and into the fire, that was an unusual day at the office, so to speak. But But I remember when I ran away from him, because I just ran backwards away from him as he was shouting after me. No, just come here a minute. Like, no. But when I went back to the debrief for that, I was giggling. You know, I was I enjoyed that. I have to admit it. I enjoyed that experience. As the years went on, I got more and more weary. It got harder, and I wasn't giggling anymore. But you know,
Right.
the younger I was, the more I seemed to enjoy it.
Something that's often talked about, and you alluded to it just now, is this concept of a legend. So your backstory. And that's obviously really important because that gives you the validity, and it also enables you to, you know, to be accepted, but also talk very quickly on your feet. How easy and how much work would you put into that?
It needed more time to build the legend as time went on, as the testing got much more difficult. Now, the legend building that goes on for level 1 undercover work is much more substantial than anything that I did. But as time went on, I was having to spend time in other places. So just before one operation, I was going to be talk about doing market trading. And so for that, I went to a market in Chesterfield. I went into the local pub that I was going to be talking about. I found out the name of the bar staff, you know, all of these kind of sort of details that you might need to dip into. Now, you don't need a huge tome of them, but you just need some things in your toolbox that can be verifiable if you reach that point where it needs to be verified. So, I mean, I did it sparsely because that was the level of that was the nature of the work that I did, but it just got more complicated over time.
And how did that play out within your home life? I mean, you talked in terms of obviously having to lie and having to be deceitful. How did that play out amongst your loved ones, amongst the people that you were seeing at the time, your friends?
Well, it was made very clear to me very early, and quite forcefully, actually, that I cannot tell anybody about this. I can't, because it would make it dangerous, and people cannot resist gossip. You know, they cannot resist making a comment, even the people you think you can trust. So it was made it clear to me that I couldn't tell anybody. So when I was working away, you know, I couldn't tell the wife what I was doing, really. I sort of, not completely, you know, I hinted at it, and you know, she learned not to ask, but I did have breaks in between operations, so it wasn't like constant work. But even when I was working, say, 7 months, I would quite often build into my legend, build into my storytelling that I had to go somewhere at the weekend, and I would quite often go home and take my kids swimming on Sunday morning, which is quite a peculiar shift of pace, really. Buying heroin and crack from gangsters one day, and then giggling with the kids, you know, in the swimming baths the next. It was a stark contrast, but you know, I managed it. But I also had a slight difficulty in that I was also in an abusive relationship. My wife was abusive to me, so in some ways, it was relaxing for me to go away and buy crack from gangsters, and also me being away seemed to take the heat out of some of the problems in the relationship.
And in terms of that lying, that whole concept of having to be deceitful, what did that do to you as a person?
Well, as I say, I enjoyed the manipulation and the lying. Now, whether that gives me a hint of being a sociopath or something, I don't know. But I enjoyed it, but it wasn't the ethics of the lying to people that really got to me. It was the ethics of the work that I was doing, because you know, I had a very stigmatized view of problematic drug consumers when I went into the police, a very basic way of looking down upon them. But it became quite obvious quite quickly to me that the problematic heroin and crack consumers that I was mingling with and manipulating, they were all self-medicating for childhood trauma. You know, I listened to them. I spent a lot of time listening to them. Weaponizing empathy, I refer to it as nowadays. And they were all people who had been sexually abused, or they'd been physical abuse or neglected children. And now I know, of course, that the academic evidence is quite clear that that's why people use these drugs problematically. So that created situation where I was feeling guilty for the harm I was causing them, because quite often they would get arrested themselves, they would get prison sentences themselves. And in fact, there was one guy who I got really friendly with, actually. I used to go shoplifting with him, which was great fun. It really was. And he ended up getting a 3.5-year sentence. But when he was arrested, because he'd been committing offences on bail when I was spending time with him, he ended up on minute-to-minute watch in the cells, suicide watch. And the reason, as he told the interviewing officers, was that he thought I was his one friend in the world, the one person that he could talk to. He'd never been able to talk to anyone about the things that he was doing. And that was the last straw for him, that betrayal that made him suicidal. So that was a very tangible example of the harm that I was causing. And that very much affected me. And I wrestled with the ethics of that for years. And I still kept taking the decision to keep doing the work, because I was following the view that the end justified the means. That it was worth causing harm to these people, these vulnerable people, in order to catch the gangsters at the end of the operation.
And I remember one particular, the drug scene. There was obviously the death of Leah Betts in 1995. Now that kind of brought to the forefront of everyone's attention, kind of like the rave scene, the drug scene, the MDMA, the ecstasy. That kind of became I suppose it was the height of those drugs getting into circulation. What were you doing around that time?
I didn't do that much with the dance music scene. Most of the work that I did was heroin and crack cocaine, which is a very, very different scene indeed. However, I did do some events, some nightclubs, when it was sold to me that that it was organised crime selling the cocaine in the clubs or whatever. And I remember I'd been sent into a free party in about 1997. The free party scene was the cultural core of the whole dance music scene, really. And I remember the drug squad saying that, there's some big hitters coming to this party. And I remember I went into it, and I was with a companion, a woman who was brilliant, called Kate. And we went in there, and these people said, "Oh, do you need some pills?" And they gave us some pills. And I says, "Oh, how much?" I was, "Oh, no, you just look like you need them." So they weren't selling them. It was just like a hippie scene. And some people turned up from Notting, but they weren't big hitters. They were all just hippies. It was right. So we just thought, this is not what we signed up for. And so Kate said, "There's no way I'm gathering evidence against these people. Just no way. No way." And we thought, yeah, you're right. We're not going to. We're not going to do that. So actually we were quite naughty, because Kate said, "Well, let's just get stoned." And she scored some cannabis. And I suppose that's one example of being seduced into the scene, really, because I just joined in and we both got stoned. And I remember having danced to some really great techno for a few hours. I remember coming out of that thinking my undercover days are gone. This is all over now. And in some way I was feeling a little bit relieved, because it was...
because you got stoned?
Yeah, because I got stoned, yeah. Because I thought this is going to be quite obvious. We're still giggling and like, how are we going to do this debrief? But they didn't say a word at all. They didn't say a word. We just gave them the drugs that we'd bought, gave them a rough description, and that was the end of that operation. But I mean, to me, that scene was not what undercover work was for. It just wasn't, and it wasn't to most of us, really. But you mentioned Leah Betts. I think it's really important to say that all of the MDMA deaths are because the drug is unregulated. So it's caused by the market being illegal.
Just want to talk a little bit about heroin and crack cocaine. So in terms of heroin, your type of people that use heroin, you often get this imagination, train stopping, this type of concept of these people. Are those the people that you were dealing with?
Yeah, I was dealing with. I mean, whenever I would go into an inner city area, I would look for the most vulnerable people, because the most vulnerable people are the easiest to manipulate. And quite often, the most vulnerable are the people who are using the largest amounts of drugs the most problematically. And they always know that the local sort of regional dealers, the step up the ladder. So Yeah, so the market that I was moving in really was the problematic market of heroin. Now, heroin's different to other drugs in that 25% of people who use it develop a problematic relationship with it, whereas with all the other drugs, it's around 10%, same as alcohol.
Right.
And of course, with heroin, problematic consumption can be very extreme, very, very, and with a policing background, you'll know just how much crime a very small cohort of people can commit to pay for a heroin habit. So yeah, that's the people I was meeting, and that's the people I would spend the most time with, because they are the most lucrative people. They're the people that organise crime. They want to exploit that group because they can get them to increase their consumption, to commit crime, to pay for it. So they're bringing in stolen property that they can trade as well. They're really very lucrative people to corner, which is the reason why we have county lines now. Police are very good at catching dealers through undercover work, through informants. The use of children is the perfect tactic in response to police success. And but the reason for that is because it's so lucrative. It's by far the most lucrative drug market, the problematic.
Do you think, has there been an increase or decrease in the amount of heroin and crack cocaine that's on the streets?
Well, the amount on the streets is just the response to the market size hasn't changed. No, it hasn't.
Right.
The numbers of problematic consumers of heroin and crack cocaine has stayed relatively stable, really, for the last 20 years. It went from about 1,000 in 1970 to 300,000 by 1984. And that's because we stopped prescribing it. We stopped medicalizing it. But it's stayed around that amount since. So it's not, there's figures to suggest that the production of cocaine has gone up by 35% in just the last 12 months worldwide. But that's not put more on the streets. That's just meant that the price has gone down and purity's gone up. That's because the market size has stayed the same.
So how do we tackle it? I mean, I'm getting a sense from you is that you're feeling that there's a way to deal with this, and it very much is around decriminalizing.
Well, decriminalizing is a good idea because we shouldn't be criminalizing these vulnerable people who need help. We shouldn't be. But that doesn't, we have to look at this through a policing lens, and decriminalizing doesn't go far enough. Because the only way to take the power away from organised crime is to take control of the drug markets by legal regulation. It's all out of control at the moment. Who these drugs are sold to and what goes in these drugs is decided by organised crime, and that's not acceptable at all. So we need to take control. Now, it's not just me saying this. I'm part of the growing international movement of police and other law enforcement who are calling for an evidence-based drug policy. I'm from the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And what we advocate is for legal regulation of all the drugs. Now, how that regulation is formed depends on the relative risks of the drug. So heroin, for example, is actually the easiest to regulate because we've got the systems in place in the UK already. We used to have the British system, which meant that if you had a problem with heroin, you went to a doctor and the doctor prescribed it to you, which meant you were never going to be exploited by organised crime. There would never be any incentive for you to find more people to use heroin, more customers, because there's no business incentive. There's no finances involved at all. It's just between you and the doctor. And at the time that system stopped, there was only 1,046 heroin consumers in the UK. It went up to 300,000 in less than 15 years because the market was handed to organised crime. So for the other drugs,
No. I mean, I think that's very interesting. So basically, I mean, at the moment, my understanding is that doctors, the medical professions, they prescribe methadone as a substitute. Is that right? They don't prescribe heroin, do they?
Well, there is still about 150 people in receipt of heroin through the British system in the UK.
Is that okay?
Yeah. And there was a trial in Middlesbrough where the problematic consumers were given heroin in a clinic in Middlesbrough, but that was shut down in December, really, through political cowardice, despite the fact that there was clear evidence that it was saving lives, improving people's lives, and dramatically reducing crime, really dramatically reducing crime, as the evidence always shows. So it has happened. I think it's about to start happening in Scotland if they can just figure out the last bits of the licensing. So yeah, it can happen. but it needs to happen because overnight, if it was widespread, if heroin prescribing was widespread, it would almost eliminate almost all of the county lines drug dealing overnight. So it's desperate that we do this.
But would it? So bearing in mind, organised crime is about finances. You know, they don't care which area it is, and they go for the most profitable. Do you think that being supplied by your doctor would eliminate it to such a degree? So you could say, right, I want some heroin, I'm going to go and get it from my doctor. But what if you were then, actually, I want more than my doctor is going to prescribe? Are you not going to then go down the black market?
Well, that's a really good question, actually. And Switzerland, in 1994, they started prescribing heroin widespread to problematic consumers. And they used British evidence to inform their policy in 1994, at a point when we went the opposite way and went harder on it. As a result, Switzerland was the only European country to have a reduction in crime through the 1990s. Now, you'll remember how much crime was increasing through the 90s and how bad it was, just how bad it was everywhere. Not in Switzerland. They reduced their burglaries by 50% by doing this. And to answer your question specifically, in Switzerland, and just like the British system, if you found that you'd need, it's up to you to decide how much heroin you need. And in Switzerland, almost every patient increases their quantity every day because they want to keep having more. And they increase it on average between 6 and 8 weeks. And when they reach the 6 and 8 weeks point, they decide themselves, in almost every case, to start reducing it. Because their life has been stabilized, they're not having to spend all day trying to find the money for the next fix. They've got stability, they've got support, they're going into this clinic where it's being provided to them in a clean setting, and they can have counselling, therapy. They can even get a job if they want to, because they haven't got a chaotic life anymore.
That is quite fascinating, and you're saying empirical evidence is showing that actually works. But realistically, could that ever happen in this country?
Well, we have a history of it. We don't even need to change in the law to do that, because it's us that invented this system. It's called the British system, capital B and capital S. So yes, we can. We just need the growing political support for it, and it is growing. But it's just frustrating where in Middlesbrough, originally that scheme was paid for by the Police and Crime Commissioner, Barry Coppinger. And he did that because he's seen the evidence. He knew his crime figures would be better if he did it, and they were. But it's been a change of Police and Crime Commissioner who is more playing to the gallery with get tough policies rather than actually looking at the evidence of that policy.
And would you do that across every drug?
No, it's only appropriate for heroin and to a certain degree for people who are using crack cocaine problematically as well. But it would depend on there's a lot more work to be done in terms of who to decide to give that to. But for heroin, yeah, I would be much more liberal even than the Swiss system, to be honest, because the benefits are too important. And it's very important for us to dramatically reduce the exploitation of children, which that would do. For other drugs, you have entirely different forms of regulation, entirely different. So for cannabis, you have retail outlets, cannabis social clubs, things like that. And we have the evidence now from North America, which proves that a legal regulated adult cannabis market protects children better than prohibition does, because in every single jurisdiction in North America where the cannabis is legally regulated, underage consumption has dropped. Imperfect though most of their systems are, it is still good evidence, as we expect, that it protects children better, because in the UK it's far easier for our young to get hold of cannabis than it is alcohol or tobacco, because drug dealers don't ask for ID. And then,
fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So on.
So for the other drugs in between, you need licensed pharmacies where you have the regulated products. So MDMA, for example, the perfect example of a drug that's not banned because it's dangerous. It's dangerous because it's banned, and all of the deaths are because it's an unregulated product.
And so your focus very much is that what your work is very much around now, is to try to educate, how drugs, we have to change the policy in relation to drugs, and we have to change the whole way we police drugs?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a full-time activist as part of the movement, the worldwide movement. And, really, I'm still fighting organized crime. That's what I'm doing. But this is a more effective way of doing it, where we can actually beat them or we can at least level the playing field. Because as the National Crime Agency says in their strategic assessments into organised crime, that the value in the illicit drug markets is routinely reinvested into other forms of criminality. Another way of wording that is that it makes other form of criminality possible, because you need that investment bank in order to do it. So we need to cripple organised crime, and that's why I'm active. Yes, but also we need to be aware. We need to be aware that how policing drugs is actually causing huge harm. The actual mechanism of policing it, because the police, in good faith, act on the law, and they will keep doing the warrants, they will keep making the arrests, they'll keep using the informants. But whenever you have a successful operation, you catch a kingpin character, a gang, or whatever, you create a gap in the market. That's an opportunity, and that opportunity is more often than not fought over. And so more often than not, in the wake of successful drugs operations, violence actually goes up. We've seen this. We see this through our criminal intelligence databases all over the world. This is noted by our membership in Baltimore or Melbourne in Australia. Violence goes up. And this is a very stark thing to consider within policing through a policing lens, because you'll know that if you catch a burglar in a community, then burglaries are likely to fall, because there are a limited number of people committing that crime in a community. If you arrest a drug dealer in a community, crime will more often go up, not down, because you're not reducing crime at all by arresting a dealer. And also, the long-term action of policing in the drug markets is increasing corruption. Now, I don't know how much you've come across corruption, but I've come across it a great deal. In fact, I'll tell you about one if you like. If we've got time, have we?
Yeah. Tell me.
So, the interrogation with the knife into my groin that I was telling you about, the day after that was about 4.5 months into that operation. The day after, I went into the morning briefing. It was quite an early briefing, and 2 of my backup team had gone off sick, so we were running short. So I was introduced to 2 new cops. Now, I didn't like this. I didn't like meeting new cops halfway through a job. Most unsettling. But I shook the hand of the first guy. I had no problem with him at all. It seemed fine. The second one, I shook his hand, and the hairs just went up on the back of my neck. Instinctively, this guy was wrong. So I went to the SIO running the operation. I said, "Look, boss, I can't have this guy knowing what I'm doing. I just don't trust him." And the SIO was brilliant. He says, "Right, well, we'll exclude them both. They've not been in the briefing. They don't know anything about this. It'll be fine." So I put it out of my head. 12 months later, when Colin Gunn was arrested by a brilliant operation by Nottinghamshire Constabulary, when he was locked up and all his team was locked up, it was found out that this cop I'd taken exception to was an employee of Colin Gunn.
No.
And I used the word employee specifically because he was paid to join the police. He wasn't corrupted whilst he was in. He was paid to join. And he'd been in the police for 7 years by the time I met him. He was being paid £2,000 a month, plus bonuses for good information on top of his police wage, obviously. Now, in the debrief for this, one senior cop said to me, one senior covert cop said, look, Woodsy, we know this happens. Of course this happens. With this much money involved, how can it not happen? And that's the point, because, it's very important to point out that there isn't enough money in any other form of organised criminality to pay for that level of corruption. There isn't. There isn't the value to do it.
Yeah.
But it's not just the value that means this kind of corruption is inevitable and that we can't defend against it. It's actually the actions of policing. So I'll try and put this, what I mean, in straightforward terms. So say you catch a kingpin character or a gang which is controlling the supply of heroin and crack cocaine in one half of a city. Yeah. Creates a gap in the market. Quite often it's fought over, it takes a while for the dust to settle. But the gang or kingpin character that's most able to take up that opportunity that's being created is someone who controls the other half of a city. So what we are doing quite often is we are increasing the market share of people. And in fact, we know from all around the world that that organised crime use police informants to manipulate the police into getting rid of the competition as well. So we're creating these monopolies at all levels of the market, both regional, citywide, and internationally. And what this means is where you create a monopoly or a cooperative, then that monopoly have increased their market share and they've increased their disposable income. And if you increase the disposable income that you control as in organised crime, you will always invest it in corruption. Always. That's your main drive, because that's how the most effective way of developing your business model is through corruption. So this mechanism of policing, where we're celebrating the arrests, we're celebrating the sizes of the seizures, actually look what's actually happening to the changing drug market over time, what we're doing. And there's examples of this all over the world. I mean, look at the Mexicans. There used to be 20 cartels. Now there's 3. And those cartels are incredibly powerful. The GDP of those cartels is bigger than most West African countries. Those West African countries have been corrupted. They're now narco states. We've caused this. We've actually caused it through prohibition.
It is huge. So what's next for you, Neil? What's your big focus at the moment?
Well, I'm speaking more at the moment on the climate crisis than anything else. So I'm doing lots of conferences on that topic. And so just to extend what I've just said about corruption, is to solve the climate crisis, we have to have good governance. Without good governance, you cannot stop deforestation, for example. And so all of the equatorial countries that signed up to the deforestation pledge at COP26, many of them, that signature means nothing, because those governments don't control their own backyard. Transnational drugs, organised crime control their forests. And because the blanket corruption that's come from the drug markets, so you've got places like Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, Honduras, Venezuela, they're narco states. They're not legitimate government anymore. They're run by drugs gangsters. They're not interested in the forest, so that signature's meaningless. And that blanket corruption that's been caused makes every other kind of environmental crime easy, because the corruption's done already. You've already taken over the government, so you can do what you want now because you've paid for it. Which means that drug money is reinvested into logging, deforestation. It's reinvested into illegal mining. It's reinvested into illegal fishing. And this sort of superheated economy of the unregulated drug market is literally destroying the planet. And we can't stop it. We can't bring in regulations to control deforestation because we don't have the governance. So this is a piece of the puzzle that many of us within the movement are desperately trying to get out there. It's taking shape at the moment. We're working with some environmentalist groups as well and just trying to bring the movement together. But it's urgent, really. It is urgent that we make people understand this link.
Neil, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, I think it's fascinating listening to you, and actually one of the things that comes out of this, and I'd be interested to hear from listeners what their view is in relation to this, is the change in the policy, the change in the way that we deal with drugs, the way that we police it. Because actually, if we allow people to get prescriptions from doctors, the evidence is there. The evidence is there from Scandinavian countries, as you talk about, in relation to reducing that. And actually, we need to think much wider rather than just simply saying, do you know what? We'll arrest our way out of this. We'll police our way out of it. And actually, we need to do more. So, Neil, I thank you so much, and keep going with the excellent work that you're doing, both in terms of drugs and obviously, your climate work as well now. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was good talking with you today.
Brilliant. Take care. Well, that was Neil Woods. Fascinating chat in relation to the work that he's done undercover, risking his life on many occasions. You've heard him talking about those occasions, but more importantly, changing the way that police should now police drugs. He comes up with a very different and very interesting view in relation to that. And he talks a lot of sense. Actually, politicians should really listen to that. And it is a challenge. Of course, it's a challenge when you're going to allow people to have the very things that destroy their life. Is that right? Is that the right thing that we should do? But actually, if it reduces crime, and actually if after 16, 18 weeks they come back and start taking less, then maybe there is real value in that. I think what he said, really does make you think that actually we do need to change, because a war on drugs as it is currently is not being won. So thank you very much, Neil Woods. Well, next week we have Michael Hallows, who's a former Scotland Yard detective. We'll be discussing his book, Operation Awan, which is the untold inside story of Britain's biggest gun running investigation, which he led. It explores how MAC-10 machine guns began appearing in gangland shootings in the 1990s, and the length at which Michael and his colleagues in the police had to go to bring them to justice, including a Home Office scandal. Machine guns from the investigation are still in circulation today. So join me next week, Thursday, the 4th of May, 12:30, live on Talking True Cases. Until then, look after yourself.